Overall strategic appreciation. The left seeks to establish institutional control throughout government and culture, while conservatives focus narrowly on political power, tactical political advantage, and incrementalism, all the while yielding to narratives that render them docile to the left. These narratives operate to establish a series of binary choices, often false, structured to make it easier for people to comply than to resist. As the narratives mature, resistance is perceived as obstructive stubbornness, at which point those individuals and groups become vulnerable to escalating attacks. While postmodern narratives have been generally enforced by political correctness, the standard of enforcement is escalating to hate speech memes. There is only the illusion of a middle ground or third ways. Properly understood, when mainstream or conservative values move to the middle, they are actually positioning themselves for negation in a process that establishes the dialectical dualism required for Aufheben. This approach allows the left to frame the problems of society as a way to provide their solutions without opportunity for compromise. Belladad explained the effectiveness of this tactic back in the early 1950s from her own experience as a CPUSA executive in the 1930s. Quote, "The communist theory of getting where it wants is through conflict, creating conflict. They will very often create an organization for the purpose of engendering conflict. If no conflict exists, they will engender the conflict and engender it in a certain position which drags the whole public opinion to the left in the direction of communism. And so, when I was in the teachers' union, we had communists, we had socialists, we had all kinds of splinter groups. They never create the conflict and confusion way over on the right, but they will create a right in order to have the left oppose it, so they can drag people in the direction of the left." Unquote. In the United States, the left wields power within society through direct and indirect control of the masses, through the control of culture. As noted, Mao Zedong called this approach mass line and described it as from the masses to the masses. This was Mao's way of describing the introduction of institutionally led Marxist solutions that appear to emerge from society, but are in fact engineered through prevailing narratives reinforced by a cadre, which is a group of indoctrinated leaders within a movement who are constantly agitating for greater socialist programs. This is consistent with Marx's original concept of the proletariat in action, Marx 1.0. This is also the plan Marcuse ratified. As the Colorado Democracy Alliance and the organizations identified in the grievance section demonstrate, this process is well underway. For example, a 2017 FCC determination on net neutrality received more than 22 million public comments, 94% of which were multiple submissions, and some many hundreds of thousands of times. Nearly every citizen engagement laboratory group conducted its part in an advocacy campaign directed at net neutrality, including a new group, Faithful Internet. The left's principal effort is political warfare through the mobilization of a vocal, ideologically committed cadre who follow direction from a core leadership, the vanguard, capable of implementing societal narratives that establish social norms. These narratives influence cultural and institutional perceptions and ultimately drive support for the left's solutions, casting all opponents to these solutions as morally deformed, intellectually defective, and unscientific. The left also deploys narratives that create the perception that women, workers, minorities, children, immigrants, and LGBTQ are under sustained attack in American society. A support infrastructure creates an echo chamber that resonates these narratives at increasing volume and pitch, creating the perception of crisis calling for immediate action. This strategy works to such effect that non-conforming views are driven underground. Owing to the ongoing success of political correctness enforcement regimes, average Americans now find themselves unable to speak their own mind, thus establishing the counter-state speech codes as the de facto speech codes among American citizens today. Another example, in 2008, then Mozilla Chief Technology Officer Brendan Eich made a $1,000 personal contribution in support of traditional marriage in California, Proposition 8. It was not until Eich became CEO 5 years later that his political contributions became an issue. Following an 11-day online shaming campaign, Eich was forced to step down. The left is ratcheting up its anti-American rhetoric in an effort to further delegitimize national identity, including the very idea of America. In their attacks, American history, the non-radicalized population, Judeo-Christian cultural norms, the rule of law, free speech, and freedom of association are all under sustained attack. Quote-unquote white privilege and quote-unquote white nationalism are institutionalizing themselves as the replacement terms for our constitutional rights and American national identity in anticipation of being negated. The left's end state. Ends. The end state objective of the left is the deconstruction of America through the imposition of the dialectic along the lines discussed, reducing American cultural awareness and ultimately Western civilization to incoherence. The left does this by imposing group rights to undermine individual rights. The transition from inalienable rights inherent in the person to privileges granted by the state was in many respects made inevitable by Wilson's evolution from the constitutional Newtonian state to the statist Darwinian. Certainly, this movement dramatically accelerated under the neo-Marxist left. The left's transformation of America includes the following. America. Rights inherent in the person in which the people are sovereign. The left's America. Post-negation. Privileges granted to groups by the state. America. National identity and principles grounded in the Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights. The left's America. Post-negation. A nameless, unaccountable international order. America. Being American as an identity. As a matter of definition, nations have national cultures, languages, and traditions. The left's America. Post-negation. All aspects of American identity delegitimized and criminalized. America. Individual sovereignty enshrined in the Bill of Rights. The left's America. Post-negation. A statist construct driven by might makes right, will to power. America. A leader of Western civilization. The left's America. Post-negation. A random player in a deformed West. America. Individual responsibility. The left's America. Post-negation. Statist control of life decisions. The end state cannot be disassociated from the ideology that visualizes it. As such, it is just as important to understand the ideological how of the end state as it is to understand the end state itself. The ideology is Marxism, but just try to use that term in polite society or in national security workspaces. The defining language of Marxism has been suppressed. The ideological how has put America under such a sustained assault for so long by that which will not be named narratives that our understanding of the ideological how has been wiped from our analytical processes, causing plans based on such analysis to misfire. Labels are so defining, we shouldn't define ourselves or our movements. Entire lines of analysis, including counterintelligence efforts, have been neutralized by simply applying a Maoist tactic based on the use of thought-terminating clichés. Candidate Trump was disarmingly effective in his attacks on the media at precisely this point. As the focus is on dialectical Marxism from a Maoist perspective, the end state assessment should reflect an awareness that cultures are to be fully immersed in such processes as part of a continuous effort. For example, going back to Marx, the left prides itself on its Wissenschaftler Sozialismus, scientific socialism, always analyzing engagement strategies in terms of correlation of forces assessments, so that, when lines of operation fail, time is taken to assess errors in the assessment that caused the failure. President Trump's election appears to have caused the left to seize up in just this manner, pondering an article arguing that the left's defeat was because it forgot, quote, how important identity was to people, and instead promoted an empty cosmopolitan globalism that made many feel left behind, unquote. President Obama mused, quote, what if we were wrong? Maybe we pushed too far. Maybe people just want to fall back into their tribe. Sometimes I wonder whether I was 10 or 20 years too early, unquote. This comment reveals the dialectical nature of Obama's thinking, even informing his understanding of his own place in history. As the thinking goes, had history progressed just a little farther forward before he became president, or had he been elected just 10 or 20 years later, Obama might truly have become that Napoleonic figure in charge of a fully self-actualized, rights-allocating state, that he was to be Hegel's man of action, in whom the universal truly merged with the particular in the individual. From a dialectical perspective, Trump's easy undoing of Obama's policies does not simply reflect the give and take of the political process, but rather the undoing of Obama's own inevitability in terms of Obama's own march of history regime. In this, Obama's musings reflect the mental trap inherent in dialectical thinking, that all such thought becomes caught up in the grimoire of Vogelin's second reality, and Pieper's pseudo-reality, and Lifton's originators of the word. This is an exploitable vulnerability, as important, while it is essential to recognize the pseudo-reality that the dialectic imposes. It is equally important to recognize that we do not have to play the role that the pseudo-reality assigns us. Just because the left is trapped in a dialectical delusion of its own making does not mean we have to participate in it as well. In fact, as long as we do, there is no way ahead. The left wants to trap us in their delusions. Yet, from that same New York Times article from May 2018, there is something more to Obama's musings. In it, Obama affirmed his administration's determination to suppress national identity in favor of a global one. This view was affirmed when, relying on Ben Rhodes, we are told that Obama, quote, urged Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada to take on a more vocal role defending the values they shared, unquote, and that, quote, Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany told Mr. Obama that she felt more obliged to run for another term because of Mr. Trump's election to defend the liberal international order, unquote. Of course, the left is intent on undermining national identity in favor of an international order. This process requires the systematic destruction of national identity. In Europe, this process has advanced to the point of criminalizing defenses of national identity. One need only listen in at international forums like the OSCE to recognize that the language of diplomacy cannot be distinguished from Euro-leftist narratives. Of course, this is happening before our eyes, in the open. But just say it. Just respond to what Obama, Rhodes, Trudeau, and Merkel openly speak to in critical terms, and wait to be accused of being a McCarthyite, a conspiracy theorist, a hater, a racist, a fascist, a genderist, etc. This brings us back to Mao's thought reform tactics that Dr. Lifton labeled thought-terminating clichés that reduce any critical discussion of the left to an ill-informed sacrilege. Thought-terminating clichés are, quote, the most far-reaching and complex of human problems, compressed into brief, highly reductive, definitive-sounding phrases, easily memorized and easily expressed. They become the start and finish of any ideological analysis. Associated with these clichés are a claimed certitude of sacred science and an underlying assumption that language, like all other human products, can be owned and operated by the movement. Thought-terminating clichés seek the subordination of human experience to the claims of doctrine that have much to do with the peculiar aura of half-reality which a totalist environment facilitates. By design, thought-terminating clichés render the individual linguistically deprived, with the only consideration for their use being their usefulness to the cause." Unquote. In tandem with postmodern narratives, thought-terminating clichés have been a staple of the American left for decades. As with politically correct narratives, their deployment has succeeded to the point where they are primarily enforced by the controlled opposition against its own base. In contrast to establishment Republicans held hostage by such narratives, the left is unhinged by the effortless manner by which Trump cuts through those clichés and turns them in on themselves. Quote, "I don't know why you'd say that. Such a racist question," unquote, Trump said. The experience of being victimized into silence by such rhetoric is what makes Trump so popular among the base that elected him. This carries forward to his attacks on the 24-hour news cycle, which, properly understood, is an off-haven engine, even when it's fair and balanced. From constructed narratives to thought-terminating clichés, the left does not require its followers, fellow travelers, or United Front allies to agree to or even understand its objectives when getting them to act in furtherance of its objectives. The left can simply dress its destructive courses of action in high-sounding words like progress, liberal, justice, and freedom in order to manipulate individuals and organizations into action, often getting some to act against interest. This wholesale manipulation of language is at the core of Joseph Pieper's argument that the abuse of power, which begins with an abuse of language, reduces individuals to tools to be manipulated. As such, many of these narratives appeal to the weaknesses and pride of those to be exploited. Such appeals are what Pieper labeled flattery, yet they are designed solely to establish dominance. While it is true that the end state of the left is America's destruction, it accomplishes its mission through the dialectical processes it controls. In this respect, the how of the end state is the end state itself. By way of a Civil War analogy, Lee visualized his end state in terms of winning the archaic Napoleonic set-piece battle, while Grant recognized the operational maneuver nature of modern warfare when issuing his famous order. Quote, "Lee's army will be your objective point. Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also." Unquote. Grant's true end state was the process of destroying Lee's combat power. By the time Lee realized this, he lost the combat power to respond. Hence, today, where America seeks to defend itself through reliance on archaic political rhetoric, so goes the off-haven engines of the left. Where goes President Trump, so goes the left's swarming mass-line constellation of otherism organizations acting in a united front with standing orders to attack, to negate, and, most importantly, to never break contact. It is in recognizing the how of the left's end state that one realizes that the situation will not change until this relationship is recognized, then halted, and then reversed. Secondary effects of the left's end state. In the 1961 treatise, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, a study of brainwashing in China, psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton analyzed the forced political indoctrination programs used by the Chinese communists, labeled them totalism, and said that it subjugates the human to the ahuman. He explained from Camus that it puts, quote, an abstract idea above the human life, even if they call it history, to which they themselves have submitted in advance, and to which they will decide quite arbitrarily to submit everyone else as well. Unquote. Under the rubric of sacred science, Dr. Lifton further explained the elevation of the leftist ideology to the level of the sacred, while also providing it with the status of scientific certainty, thus rendering opposition to it both immoral and unscientific. Sound familiar? The Chinese fleeing the communist takeover identified its forced political indoctrination programs as Xi Nao, literally wash brain, i.e., brainwashing. In archetype form, these brainwashing programs are simply the viscous application of the same higher form metaphysical science by a godlike state following Hegel's dialectical form that Arthur Schopenhauer labeled the unparalleled scribblings of nonsense back in the 1840s. This is the true face of Hegel's scientism, Hegel's a priori science from Hegel's concept of reason, and statism, a state with godlike power bestriding the land, the true face of Hegel applied. These are the brainwashing tactics used by the left today. Like those of the Chinese communists, they are anti-democratic and un-American. The resources to bring these techniques to the table are impressive. The systematic attack on America's economic, social, and political structures cannot be analyzed in exclusively domestic terms, as the long-term effects of this Aufhebender culture will weaken America's position as a global leader. As this process continues inside the United States, it should not be forgotten that there are at least two foreign beneficiaries of the domestic activities of the left, China and the transnational Islamic movement. The following chart illustrates the alignment. China replaced United States as a global leader. Domestic left subordinate the United States to regional and international legal and regulatory regimes. Islamic movement undermine America's global leadership. China reduce American influence. Domestic left support the international neo-Marxist and Islamic movements through identified lines of effort. Islamic movement Islamic control of national and regional culture. China undermine America domestically. Domestic left control institutions and culture to drive neo-Marxist outcomes. Islamic movement weaken America's international and regional allies. China Chinese communist ideology. Domestic left Aufhebender culture. Islamic movement Sharia principles. China international leadership. Domestic left and international order. Islamic movement global caliphate.